Welcome to episode 17 of Conversations with a Chiropractor. A giant thank you to all of you who've been listening from the very beginning. I know some of these episodes have been long and your time is precious. It means even more to me that you've been so gracious to come back and tell me what you thought of episode 1 and 2 and 3. And so thank you. Thank you to my listeners. If you haven't done so yet, I would so appreciate a like, a review. You can be honest, subscribe. No matter where you're listening, there's a way to give me some feedback. And if you did want to be a guest on this podcast, just send me an email at drstephaniewautier@yahoo.com. That's all lowercase. One of my friends was like, Stephanie, you should really do like a synopsis, or you should really kind of discuss what has gone on from episode 1 through now. She is someone who had a little bit of a tumultuous childhood, who moved around a lot. She moved around a lot in her college years. And I thought, wow, a lot of these folks that I've interviewed, like Bertha, episode 1, who's 98 and a half. In fact, now we're like 6 weeks from her 99th birthday, grew up in a little tiny town in the Upper Peninsula, wrote letters to her friends and her future husband in World War II. And then we jumped to Kurt, who talked a lot about energy and frequency and Kangen water. It's really funny. I thought more folks would be interested in learning about that Kangen water, but I digress. Episode 3, my very sweet patient Bill, who did pass on after we had recorded that episode. And I think that was so special, for his family to hear his voice and for me to hear his voice again. We had some beautiful moments as doctor and patient, and truly we became friends. Then we jumped to me being so vulnerable with my sisters and dad and Wood As Girls part 1 and 2, where we talked about sibling rivalry. Another one of my friends who listened said, I'm surprised you didn't know more about each other. And I said, well, the interesting thing is that when I left for school, I still had a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old sister at home. And you imagine all of the things that they did in their life, after I left for college and really wasn't around day to day. There was some fun banter. I hope that you all appreciated seeing a little bit about where I came from. And then in episode 6, I had the distinct honor of talking to my friend from chiropractic school, Dr. Jill Bala, who is now practicing in Traverse City. She talked a little bit about things that I had never heard about the chiropractor who had his practice at the bottom of the hill and used to walk up and down every day, who really was her inspiration. And another time warp in episode 7, where Michelle and Eileen and I sort of took a trip down memory lane. And I think about how the three of us were these young girls in the small town of Escanaba, Michigan, and yet we were all living such distinctly different lives. And each single one of us are looking out at the world with the lens that we've been raised, to believe. I mean, I'm not saying that we can't change our beliefs, but just the difference between the three of us in high school and what that looked like. And then we jumped to episode 8, where one of my friends from college, Susan, was interviewed. Sweet, beautiful, spiritual woman. And the bizarre and interesting thing, when I started that interview and I said, oh, Susan, so you were a missionary in Haiti. And she was like, well, I wasn't a missionary. And you're going to have to listen if you don't know the story. And I said, oh my gosh, well, why didn't you ever share these things when we were living together? We were roommates. And she said, I just think that it was too fresh. Like, it was too much. It was embarrassing. It was overwhelming. And at that time, she hadn't healed from it or processed it. So, 20 some, maybe it was 30 years later when we're having this conversation, these were things that I never knew happened. One of the things I especially loved about Susan's interview was the beautiful way that she described like the male and female blending and having sort of symbiotic roles in the church, because I know that a lot of people are maybe against female pastors, and she just spoke so eloquently about that. So if you haven't listened to episode 8, please do yourself a favor and listen. And then we jumped to episode number 9, where my friend Kat and I spoke, and a lot of people are nervous about that vulnerability coming through and being so public. Kat was one of them, and we didn't publish her full name. I didn't tag her on Facebook because she and I have this sort of like motherly moment where we are sharing our birth stories, and we both tell a lot. We both share a lot of those experiences, which is, very raw, very real, very vulnerable. And I'm just so proud of her willingness to share that and not have any fear of judgment, because I think there's so many people listening who probably can really relate to some of the things that she shared. When I interviewed my friend Kim Key, who is the craniosacral therapist, in episode 10, we talked a little bit about the things she's doing. And I want to say maybe right at this moment in September 2024, she is starting to record her PBS series, where they take a woman from New York City and they bring her to a remote area in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and sort of address some of her fears. And I love that sort of big city versus rural. Again, I'm overusing the word juxtaposition, but just that contrast in the busyness of a life like in New York City versus a kind of a calm, serene, rural Upper Peninsula experience. In episode 11, my business partner, Jamie Thayer, and I do a deep dive into all of the things that we do at Glow Laser Aesthetics. We talk about our outreach program for tattoo removal. We talk about how these tools work and some of the other things that we do and that we offer. So if you're curious about how that business began, listen to episode 11. In episode 12, one of my patients talks a little bit about, she talks a lot about her journey with long COVID. And I think for some people, they assume that long COVID relates only to their lungs and pulmonary issues. But as you will hear, even in one of the first sentences of episode 12, Deb came to me numb from the waist down and was desperate to get some medical care. In episode 13, the dear sweet actress Faye Elder was interviewed. She talks about how she grew up in Marquette, Michigan, and how she was selected to be part of this Young Americans group, and then her career in California. And she, again, is very vulnerable about some of the things that happened in her childhood. I think, if anything, some of these stories just tell us about the resiliency of humans, about the desire to succeed, about the desire to overcome obstacles. And if you've listened from the very beginning, my intro was a little long, but I talked about grit and grace, and Faye definitely demonstrates and exudes grit and grace. And then she throws in some humor. So listen to episode 13, and maybe you can even Google Faye and find what she looks like when she was the Knott's Berry Farm woman. In episode 14, I talked to a woman from Negaunee, Michigan, who truly built a beauty empire from scratch. And again, she had a very tumultuous, very difficult, poor upbringing. I have this vision of something she describes of her petticoat scratching her legs so she would wear jeans to school, walking through the snow, and then she would be soaking wet. She would take those jeans and put them over the heat register in the bathroom so that she could walk home with dry pants. I think so much about the luxury of many of our lives, mine included, and I'm not always great at being positive, But I do think that it's an amazing reminder to see what obstacles do create. They create resiliency. They create people who are willing to work hard and work long and be tenacious to not only provide for themselves, but to succeed in whatever they deem as being successful. One of my favorite sort of mentors in life has been Wayne Dyer. My mom and dad actually introduced me to some of his recordings when he had been on PBS. And I remember listening to them and then getting a little bit more deep and following him because of his very tumultuous upbringing where his father left and his mom didn't have enough money to keep all of the children at home. And he and his brother were brought to an orphanage and it was very abusive. He used to say, God put me on this earth to be able to survive and then teach others how to survive. And I think we sometimes think of obstacles as like bad things. And I think we really need to change that perspective and think of them as something that's going to grow us and teach us and be grateful for those. Be grateful for those challenges. Never, what's the quote? A smooth sea never made for a skilled sailor. In episode 15, one of my dear friends and sweet patients, Tim, and I had an amazingly long conversation about him growing up in McFarland, Michigan, with his dad being a logger. There were a few things that really stuck out to me, besides perhaps the obvious, but one of them was the fact that his dad didn't have a business name, that he was just a logger and went into the woods and people knew that, and he sold his goods and his wares. So interesting now in today's world, we are consumed with the details of a business. So we get our LLC, or is it an S Corp? And then we have to file our tax ID. One of those things that was just such a contrast. And the second, when he talked a little bit about being in the service and going to all those places, I was so ready for some stories about the things he saw and the dishes he ate and experiences that he had. And he mostly was underwhelmed. He was mostly underwhelmed with being away and wanted to be home. And I do love home and I do love the UP, but I was surprised by that. I was like, oh, you got to see the world. And he was like, yeah, but I was working, and oh yeah, I was in the service. And one of the things I got to do as a 20-year-old into my 30th birthday really was be a traveling nurse. And I loved that experience, moving into a furnished apartment and having a 13-week assignment and becoming instant friends with the other nurses who were travelers. And I would work 3 12-hour shifts and then kind of consider myself a tourist. And I've had to do some amazing things. So I definitely have the travel bug. And my 16th episode, I interview my favorite photographer, Daniele Carroll. And she is right here in Marquette, Michigan. She talks a little bit about her training in California and how she got here and kind of some funny stories about how we met and, interestingly, each of our perspectives. So thank you so much for being on this journey, on these conversations with a chiropractor. I am truly grateful for all of my guests and for all of you who've listened. If you have a story to share and you would like to be a guest on Conversations with a Chiropractor, just send me an email at drstephanie.wautier@yahoo.com. And I would so appreciate anywhere you're listening if you could leave me a review, subscribe, that helps the podcast continue. Thanks again. This has been Dr. Stephanie with a review, a sort of contemplation, a compilation of the conversations with a chiropractor.